Okay, well, it shouldn't take me long to discuss what my panel is all about, because it's really about, I think, it's about my great-grandmother, who is a woman who is just sort of lost to history, which is sort of the basis of a lot of the artwork that I usually do. But it's interesting that there's someone in my own family who I know virtually nothing about. We know that she was born in Ireland, in Dublin. Beyond that, we don't really have any idea exactly. She came here when she was still, I think, around 2 years old. And we don't know much about that history at all. So she married my great-grandfather, and who was born here in the U.S. And she died in 1944. And there's sort of a lost history that's there. The image on my panel is actually the only photograph that we have of her.
Okay. My great-great-grandfather, John McMurray, was born in Belfast, Ireland in 1826. And he was a farmer, and he immigrated to the United States during the potato famine, which lasted from 1845 to 1856. He settled in a small town in Illinois, and he had a son, my great-grandfather, Dr. John McMurray, and he delivered a lot of babies and did a lot of health issues for people for free in the little town of Illinois, and he had a lot of babies that were named after him as a result. And people would bring produce to his house and leave them on a doorstep for him in payment because he didn't have the money. He also was the officer in a bank. And then he had my grandmother, Alice Pauline McMurray, and I unfortunately did not know her because she died. She passed away 3 months before I was born. But my mother talked about her and said she was a wonderful mother and she loved to bake. And Dr. McMurray actually lived with my mother and helped raise her because her father passed away at the age of 6. So he was a wonderful man. The McMurrays were a wonderful family and did great things here for the United States, and then have a great family now.
My panel is in honor of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Becky Lazarus, who lived with us as I was growing up. She was a very warm, loving woman who never went to school, immigrated from Russia, and I learned so much from her. The most valuable thing I think she ever taught me was that real lessons in life come from experience. And I just think of her all the time, and she warms my heart.
Hi, my panel is about Johann Georg Roch, also known as Smoke. When the Rochs came to America from Germany, they didn't understand the pronunciation of his last name, and so he pointed to a smokestack, and they said, "Oh, smoke." And so our name went from Roch to Smoke. And so my panel is about him and his wife Mary and their 2 boys that came with them on the ship called the Robert and Alice. And they originally went to Pennsylvania, then they ended up settling in South Carolina. And before he died, he was known as the great patriarch of South Carolina because he had 127 descendants. And there's actually a town named after us in South Carolina called Smoke, South Carolina. Thank you very much.
Well, I came to the United States in 1981 with my husband, who was here to do a PhD program, and we ended up staying because we had relatives and they sponsored us to immigrate. We did immigrate and became US citizens, but I came from the Middle East, and it was very hard for me to actually put this panel together because I couldn't decide among all of my experiences in the Middle East which ones sort of zeroed in on me personally. So in the end, I decided to go a little bit symbolic. My panel consists of a large fig leaf, which is actually an outline of a real fig leaf, because figs in the Middle East are considered a fruit of hospitality, and this is part of my culture. And then I put all kinds of things around the fig leaf, including my signature in Arabic script, because I'm an Arab. And I put in colors of desert sands, which go from pink all the way to tan, sand color, so-called, and blue. I put in embroidery motifs because we have a lot of embroidery in the Middle East, and the embroidery motifs indicate trees, they indicate flowers, they also indicate the sea. The zigzag pattern is the seaside, the seashore. There's usually a line drawn under the zigzag which indicates the shore actually of the sea. So that's basically what I did. I also put, because I'm a relatively recent newcomer and I'm the first person of my generation to come to the United States, I drew a Turkish coffee pot in the corner with a turned over cup of coffee actually spilling its coffee from inside, because that's the way, you know, women who come together in a circle to drink coffee will read each other's fortune. They do it by reading the pattern left by the coffee when you turn the cup over and empty it out into a saucer. So my coffee cup, when I left the Middle East to come here, typically said, "You have a long journey ahead of you." So here it is. I'm on my long journey, and I came in 1981, and I'm still doing it.
My panel is about my great-grandmother on my father's side. Her name was Bergilde Husby, and she came over to the US from Norway in 1915. She was 15 years old and came over just with her sister and came through Ellis Island, and my grandmother was able to preserve her ship manifest, her boarding materials, as well as several photographs of her and of the ship. She did make her way from New York to Iowa and then on to Michigan, where she had her family and had my grandmother. And that's where she changed her name to Hilda. So we always talk about Hilda and how she started a brand new life here in the United States.
Hi, I decided to focus on my maternal grandparents, who are Mennonites. Actually, both sides of my family are Mennonites, but this grandfather I was especially close to, and my grandmother, and they left Alsace-Lorraine in about the 1800s, came through Canada and then into the Midwest, and they were farmers. But my grandfather was also a minister, a Mennonite minister, and my panel is a quilt on the background because Mennonites are quilters, and then there is rows of his crop, which was his prize melon, which he sold to the hotels, and he invented a little tent to put over the cantaloupe mound to grow quicker. And the other aspect in my panel is about my grandmother, who was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, and their culture made these hand-painted, I guess, report cards at the end of the term. They're called fractures, F-R-A-K-T-U-R. You can look it up. And they're beautiful sort of folk art painted with beautiful script, and that was what was given to each child at the end of the year, all complimentary.
My piece is about my mother's immigration from Germany, from Berlin. Actually, her childhood, she was born today, September 17th, 1927, and today is her 90th birthday. So my piece shares her experience, her growing up in Berlin, her departure through Holland, and finally her arrival in the United States on September 18th, 1938.
From Kerry, America is just beyond the setting sun. I'm of the Atlantic. As a child in Kerry, the southwest of Ireland, I learned that Greenland lies to the west, Newfoundland just south of west, and America lies southwest, beyond the setting sun. This was even before I had learned to row in a vogue or steer a small sailboat. Kerry people have voyaged the Atlantic since the earliest times. We're seafarers since before the Bronze Age. My ancestors were Cape Horners, bringing Cornish miners to the San Francisco gold rush. They were in the Royal Navy, Her Majesty's Coast Guard, and they were Western Union cablemen tying Europe to Newfoundland. I've sailed many ocean voyages from Ireland to Spain, across the Atlantic, up to Canada, down to the Caribbean. So it was a very simple thing to move and settle in the wider spaces, the warmer clime, the taller forests of tulip trees, scented with wild wisteria of Maryland, near the Chesapeake Bay, the land of pleasant living.
My panel is about what I know of my family, who my father tells me, my father who's big into genealogy, tells me that we immigrated over here from Germany and the Czech Republic. I think it was Bohemia actually, but they landed in New York City and somehow made their way out to the plains of Nebraska to do what I call affectionately dirt farming. But my father also tells me that there was traveling photographers that would come around and photograph whatever you wanted to photograph. So the people that I show in my photograph aren't really my family, but I think they're tied together because of probably the struggles and strife that they had being on the plains of Nebraska and the harsh conditions they probably endured. You can see in the photograph there is a house behind it, or there's a couple houses behind it, which were probably sod houses, which were probably very labor intensive. I was lucky enough to be born male and white in the United States here, and so the front panel actually shows a design of a house that I did, so I kind of like superimposed it over the top of this other family. So it's kind of trying to show like everything that I have as a result of people's hardships.
My name is Martina and I'm a first-generation immigrant to the US. I have been in the States for about 15 years and I'm originally from the Czech Republic. My panel is called Community Connection, and it's been a very interesting journey for me because many of the other artists have been doing panels about an ancestor of theirs, but my panel is about my own journey, which has been it's been a journey of self-discovery. I decided to sift through 15 years of photos, of moments of togetherness and of people who have welcomed me into their homes. Hence, the panel is called Community and Connection. And I ended up creating a collage out of the photos and then recording sound waves of the two words, community, connection, and layering the sound wave, the visual of the sound wave over the collage. So I'm honoring all of the people who have opened their homes to me, and I thank them.
Hi, my panel is about John Stack the Builder, my great-great-grandfather, who came to the United States somewhere between 1847 and 1849. And he came with just a talent for carpentry and built a large building business, and many of the buildings that he built during his lifetime are still standing today in Baltimore. Several of the things that he did were all churches. Was a very devout Catholic and had a very large family. And one building that he did renovations on was the Baltimore Basilica, which is the oldest Catholic cathedral in the United States. And the story that got me interested in him was during a very large fire in Baltimore, not the Great Fire, but a large one. He and several other people climbed to the roof of the basilica and doused it with water and wet blankets to save it from all the flaming embers around. And I was quite taken with their bravery for doing that. As a contrast to their dedication to the church and Catholicism, another ancestor that I have came to the United States and founded the first Baptist church in Maryland, and that was Henry Sater. But when they dedicated the church, I just wanted to say what they said about it in writing was that we do also bind ourselves hereby to defend and live up to the Protestant religion and abhor and oppose the whore of Rome, Pope and Popery. With all her anti-Christian ways, we do also engage with our lives and fortunes to defend the crown and dignity of our gracious sovereign King George. To him and his issue forever. So you can see how different the people in my background are.
My panel is about my first Coles ancestor that came to the United States from England in the 16th century, 1589. He came from southern England. He was a Congregationalist, and I think he came both for opportunity and for religious reasons. As a Congregationalist, he really did not get along either with the Church of England or the Catholic Church. And there was persecution. For the last 100 years, England had swayed between the Church of England and the Catholic Church, and each king or queen that came into power was from on the opposite side and would persecute and murder and cause all kinds of chaos for the religious people on the other side. So partly he was escaping that. But the Congregationalists were a little different. They didn't want established religion, period. They wanted to be able to congregate. I think they needed like 16 people who were like-minded to form a congregation. And then they were able to form a church themselves and deal directly with God without any hierarchy above them. And so the Congregationalists came to the United States. This group of Congregationalists, or a bunch of them, came to the United States. They landed first in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then it was getting pretty crowded there already by that time. And so they traveled up to Connecticut, near Hartford, what is now Hartford. And it was basically, they had to walk through a trail, either on horseback or on their feet. They couldn't even get a wagon up through there. It was Indian country, which happened to be fairly friendly Indians, which was lucky for them. They could move some possessions by boat if they had enough money to pay for that. But you have to remember that when they left England, they were facing, they weren't very wealthy. That most of the people that came over at that time who were Congregationalists were from southern central England. They weren't aristocrats, nor were they very poor people. They were artisans and farmers. They didn't have that much money, and whatever they brought over on the ship, they were looking at 12 to 16 weeks in this lumbering ship that it was not a very safe or certain journey. The children on his ship, all of them died, and much of the livestock had to be slaughtered to just stay alive to get through the journey. So when they arrived in the United States, they had very little possessions to their name. And so they came up to Hartford with very little. I don't know how they made it through the winters. Their religions was very, they were not a lot of play, or they had to work, they worked hard. And I think that helped get them through. And so they got through and they continued on, and they, like immigrants in this world of ours today, they left a desperate situation both religiously and economically to try and build a new life, a very uncertain life and a very uncertain trip, and they did it because they were desperate, and that's how our country was started.
So my panel is about my grandmother's family, and it was a story about losing language, really, because her brother had come home from school and he had been teased for speaking only Swedish. And at that time, on that day, my great-grandfather said, from this day forward, we speak only English, because he realized that, I think, this is my interpretation of it, of course, but that at a certain point he knew that they had to give up something in order to participate more fully in the American culture and the American dream, and that comes at a loss. So in this case, it was the loss of language. And so today my grandmother can speak a little bit of Swedish, and it's very similar throughout those communities in the northwestern corner of Minnesota.
So it's kind of that story about loss. One of the many things that immigrants have to forfeit when they move to a new country.
My panel is about me. I'm the first generation American, and it's about me growing up behind Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union and how it was changing from Soviet Union to Russia. It has a little bit of background and some photographs of my ancestors, of my grandfather and great-grandfather on my mother's side. My mother is here with me in the United States as well, so it's kind of a maternal link to me from there.
My panel is, I'm the immigrant in it. I came to the United States in 1987, and there are, so it's just an illustration of my face, kind of like a self-portrait, but more more of an illustration. And the two arrows, one is yellow, one is green, which is the color of Brazil, which is where it came from. And the A at the center is with the ruler, which is inches, which is, U.S. is the only country that has inches in it. And also it's an A for American. And this stands right here because this means now, and then the other two arrows being from the past that came from there. So that is my panel.
My name is Jamie Downs, and my panel is about my great-grandparents, Philippina and Wilhelm Puterbaugh, who came here from Prussia on their honeymoon. He had just served in the Prussian army and came here and then got drafted for the Civil War. So they were going to go back to Prussia, but then the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and so they stayed, and so I exist. So they were about the same age as I am now when a newspaper article was written about them that was 100 years ago today, newspaper article, and that's where I'm getting a lot of this information about their life in central Pennsylvania after their honeymoon.
I did my panel on my great-grandfather, Robert John Beechnor. He came over from County Cork in Ireland. He was born in Timoleague Abbey, way down on the coast of Southern Ireland. And he came to New York when he was in his teen years. He was about 18 when he enlisted in the Union Army in New York. And he was promoted from private to first lieutenant. And when he was 20 years old, he was made captain of the 30th Colored Regiment. I think it's the 30th Company H, Colored Infantry of the Union Army. He was injured a couple of times, and he was injured once in the Battle of Wilmington. He was injured in the Battle of the Craters in Virginia, I believe it was. And after the war, he left and went to New York. He married my great-grandmother, who was from Connecticut, also Irish, the daughter of a physician who had come to this country from Ireland during the famine. They made their home in Mount Vernon, New York, and had 12 children. And my great-grandfather also went into the import-export business and crossed the Atlantic 175 times in the 19th century, doing business in Europe and Asia. Very proud of him. He died at the age of 65. He had heart issues, and he's buried in New York. And I am the grandson of his daughter, Ethel Beechnor, who married Karen Dwyer, who was also an Irish immigrant, but that's another story.
My panel is about my grandfather, John Halliday Dixon, who immigrated from Ontario, Canada to Massachusetts in 1918. He was 19 at the time, and he quickly enlisted. The war was going on. I don't believe he fought in World War I, but he did fight in World War II. And he started working right away, lived in a boarding house, and moved to Rhode Island, where he met my grandmother, my Nana, Viola Allen, and they were married and had 5 children and 15 grandchildren. He was an electrical engineer. He worked on power plants and dams around the country. And toward the end of his career, he worked in the U.S. Capitol building, as well as a lot of other government buildings. His father was from Scotland and came to Canada from Scotland, and he had many Scottish blessings and words in his vocabulary that he brought to us through the years. And he lived a very healthy life and a very good life. He was an honest man. He lived to see the camera invented and the automobile invented. And in fact, one of his favorite stories to tell us was in 1920 about the automobiles being built by Ford and how the favorite color was black, and if you ordered a car, you always said, "I'll take any color as long as it's black." And in fact, he did have a black Ford, and told us a story about coming out from the theater and seeing 6 black Fords, all identical, lined up, and getting in one, putting his key in the ignition, getting ready to pull away, and realizing that the key had started someone else's black Ford, and that's when he realized that all of the black Fords used the same key. So he passed when he was 93 in 1982, but we all think of him and miss him very much. Anyway, that's my panel story. Thank you.
My panel is dedicated to my grandmother on my father's side. Her name is Mommy Kay. When I was growing up, I would visit her after school because she only lived 2 blocks from my house. Recently, I went to a family reunion, and my first cousin, Catherine, showed me some genealogical books about her family history, about Mommy Kay's family history, and that was sort of an eye-opener. I didn't expect to know that I found out through these genealogical books that my family goes back 6 generations if you count myself. My grandmother's great-great-grandparents came from Germany, and they were both, one was 24 and the other was 23, and I think that's pretty brave that they got on a boat and they came here, and they had 2 sons, and one of the sons is my next great-grandfather. And there's so many stories I could tell about my grandmother. She was one of the greatest persons on the planet, and I really appreciate her, and it was so nice that I could make this panel about her. I found her wedding photograph, so that's what the feature piece is on my panel, and then I found another photograph of her grandparents. So I had to skip a couple of generations, but it was fun. I was surprised to find out that we've been here that long. I expected to be here just more recent arrival.
So my panel for the One House Project is a picture of my parents, Rita, Silvi, and Franco Dinale. They emigrated from Italy, and even though my upbringing was very privileged, my mother was a professor at Smith College, my father was an anesthesiologist who had studied at Harvard. We were an immigrant family in the sense that our family culture was so different from what was around us in New England, and we were always trying to figure out and translate. I know as when I was growing up, I was always trying to figure out what the rules were and how everything worked. That's why I strongly identify with all kinds of immigrants throughout the United States, and I think it's so important for us to welcome them to our culture because we all come from another place.
My square is about my grandmother, Rebecca Shapiro, who immigrated from Minsk area in Belarus in 1898. She came to America with her parents and her two sisters because of anti-Semitism at the time in Europe. There were pogroms in her village, and her shtetl was being burned, and Jewish properties were being pillaged. And then in 1920, there was a major pogrom. The whole village was burned. And in 1941, every single Jew in the shtetl, 1,600 Jews, were thrown into a pit and died. And my grandmother's two siblings, a brother and a sister, had been left behind because they were married. So we never know exactly what happened to them. We think they probably perished. So I dedicate my square to the village of Kodinov near Minsk, and to my grandmother, Rebecca Shapiro.
My panel is about my aunt. I have her on there because she's the first person who came to the US as a teenager. She left everything behind, and as the person that she is, she did everything and anything to bring the rest of the family here from Colombia to the United States. She started working here by herself, and she also went to college at Towson University. She graduated, and she's the first person to graduate with a degree. So she is someone who always says yes. She never says no to any of us, and she is the type of person that helps anyone with anything. So I admire her, and this is why I put her in my panel. I'm very proud of having her as an aunt. So this is a drawing of her.
Hi, I'm Laura Roulet. I am 11th generation in this country. The first immigrants in my family came from England in 1664 or 65. They were Richard and Elizabeth Edelin. Richard was appointed deputy surveyor in the province of Maryland, and they settled in St. Mary's County, had 6 children, and grew tobacco. For my panel, I researched on the National Portrait Gallery website in England for a family from about that time, sort of landed gentry kind of family, and found a portrait of a family from a painting that is now in the British Museum in Yale.
Hi, my name's Marion Figlio. My panel is a portrait of my great-grandmother, Minda Holtzberg Robinson. She came from a small town in Lithuania with her 6 sons in tow. The youngest must have been about 6, and the oldest was a late teen. Her husband, Abner, my great-grandfather, had come 6 years earlier, and it was only then that he had saved enough money for their passage. They decided they had to leave the Lithuania, which was under the rule of a Russian Tsar, because the Tsar had started to conscript all the Jewish young men. They had 6 sons. It was pretty easy for them to decide that now was the time to go. I know a lot about my great-grandmother. My grandmother was her youngest child, the only child born in America, and the only daughter. Minda was 43 when my grandmother was born, and for growing up, and even when she first got married, Minda and Abner always lived with Jenny and her husband, and then after he died, with Jenny and her children. My mother, who is still alive, is 94, so she grew up with this woman who was born in 1850. And all you have to do is mention something, and right now at my mother's stage of life, she'll start talking about stories. So we kind of know a lot about Minda. We know the clothes she liked to wear, and she never put on new clothes right away, that she stayed at home most of the time. She never learned English, although maybe she knew some English, but she didn't speak it, but she still knew how to call the dog next door to get him away from the Iceman, who the dog didn't like. We know her sayings. We know she had red hair. We know a lot about her and a lot about the family, and it's very real with all the stories my mother tells, that it made me feel like I was painting a living person instead of just the picture of some distant old woman.
Hi. Well, my panel, unfortunately, can cut.
Just go. If you
Okay.
need to take a break, just take a break.
Okay. So I cannot go very far back with my own ancestry. So my panel just goes up to my parents, and I was adopted. So I have two sets of families that I have shown in my panel, and my biological family, my adopted family, and I believe I've always, as an artist, had interest in identity issues. Glad to have an opportunity to make an art piece about this.
My mom immigrated from El Salvador in 1987, 88, and my panel is dedicated to her and her constant faith that she instilled on us growing up, and while I'm not practicing, it still lives with me inside.
My piece is about Mary Jane Bryant. She was born in Jacksonville, Florida. When I say Jacksonville, I actually mean to say Jackson County, Florida. She was the daughter of former slaves. Her grandmother's name was Frances, and Frances was actually sold twice. They were originally out of Georgia, but a slave owner in called Early County bought them, and they eventually made it to Jackson County, Florida. And so my great-grandmother, Mary Jane, was born there, had a very, very simple life. They were considered sharecroppers. They were considered sharecroppers. She had 9 children. They were all born close together. And again, their life was centered around the church. She was a member of Buck Home Missionary Baptist Church. And her 9 children, she had my grandmother, which was Mamie Hayes. Mamie Hayes just recently passed away. She lived to be 100 years old. And my blessing in all of this was Mamie Hayes was the one that taught me my family history. And she shared with me Mary Jane's life, Fanny's life. The interesting thing to me was they chose to stay in that area. My grandmother never left that area of Jackson County. She raised her family there as well. And as a child, we would go visit, and I was so struck with how simple the life was there. They just enjoyed each other. When I say simple, I mean very basic. You know, not the technologies that we all experience today, but they made a point of always sharing our history, which ties me right back to Mary Jane Bryant. And I was just sharing with my own daughter, you're from her genes. You know, she stood straight with her back rigid, like she was somebody. And I want you to walk through life like you're somebody. I called my mother to tell her about this project, and I said, Mom, what would you like me to share about Mary Jane? And she said, Des, I want you to tell people that she loved her family. She loved her family very much. She liked to travel, and she was a great cook. I said, okay, I'll share that. I'll share that. And she did pass away, and she's buried at Buck Home Missionary Baptist Church. And on her tombstone, which is also on my panel, is written, "Gone but not forgotten."
Third generation Washingtonian is what I am, and I was able to trace my great-grandmother to St. Mary's County, Maryland, and I found out in all my research that actually my 5th great-grandmother lived in St. Mary's County, Maryland, and she was born in 1742. So that's as far back as I can go with my ancestry research. But the picture is of my great-grandmother, Elizabeth Ann Medley.
Okay, my panel is inspired by my grandfather, who was born in 1986 in a little city called Pultusk in Poland. His family owned one of the larger No, block. Wait a minute, so, okay. Yeah, okay. Should we start over?
Wait,
okay.
Did you say 1986? Did you mean 1886?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just thought I'd tell you so you start.
Good.
Sorry, I didn't
You could say, you should just whisper in my ear. Okay.
Go ahead.
My panel is about my grandfather who was born in 1886 in a Polish small village called Pultusk, and his family owned one of the flour mills there. He was the second or third child born to a family that originally had 11 children, and then his father remarried, and there were 2 more. He may have come to the United States because he wasn't so happy about the new wife, a relative told me. But he came here, he did serve in World War I, and he lived in New York. When he got there, the name, which was originally Munsash, which means mill, his uncle who greeted him at Ellis Island said, "Now you're Miller." So my name is Anita Miller, and that is how that came about. And he had, in the United States, he owned a coat factory, which was in New York City in the garment district. And he was there for many decades, and he was always happy when I showed up to visit the factory, and the people working there would always tell me stories, and that was kind of neat. He had 2 sons. Well, the oldest was my father, and he had a number of other grandchildren and grandchildren, and he was a kind of a gruff guy. But all I can say to anybody who complained about that was that he was just loved his grandchildren. And when I went to the mill, the factory, I should say, when I went there, one of the workers always told me that he was the one who yelled at you, but he's also the one who took care of the staff, and that he was a fine man. So I'm going on that impression.
Hi. My panel has a lot of musical signatures on it. If I could have made it sing, I would have, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. Parts of my family came to the United States in 1882 on board a ship that left from somewhere in Austro-Hungary. It was a place called Czernowitz, and landed off the coast of Scotland, and then went on to the United States, to the New York Immigration Center, because that was where you landed at the time. As I understand it, my great-grandmother came over. She was 4 years old, along with her father and one of her sisters. The reason that the mother didn't come is because she was the breadwinner of the family. She was the royal embroiderer in the court at the time of Austro-Hungary. And what she did was, people at that time, royalty and nobility, wore coats where the fur was on the inside and the outside was satin or silk upon which there was embroidery, and she would embroider that with a staff of people. So they came over here, and they owned a certain amount of real estate, and she grew up and married someone who was a barber, but he was a barber in those days who let blood. And they lived in first Manhattan, and then they lived in the Bronx in New York. She learned English at the Henry Street, my grandmother, who was born here in 1906, learned English at the Henry Street Settlement House and taught her Yiddish-speaking mother to speak English as well. She went on to Hunter High School, Hunter College. She got her master's degree in education in 1923 from Columbia University, with Dewey as her advisor, and went on from there. Her brothers musically founded a place in New York, downtown, that was called the Bowery Follies, and it was a vaudeville house, but they had people playing music afterwards, blues, jazz, things like that. And she went on musically to become a concert violinist. She taught at Mannes School in New York, and she led the Hunter College Orchestra. And that led to my mother and us.
3 out of 4 of my grandparents are immigrants, but for my panel I chose to honor my grandmother, Alba and Gracia de Valle Contreras, who immigrated to the United States based on a scholarship to a university in Texas. And while she was an American citizen, she nevertheless endured a lot of the struggles that immigrants experience. In the panel is featured a caption from the Paris Junior College in Texas newspaper where the caption reads "foreign flavor," and I found it interesting that the people she was pictured with, one of them, it reads that here are 4 students from foreign countries. One of them reads from Central America as if it was a country, and then she and another peer from Puerto Rico. And it kind of reflects the attitude towards Puerto Ricans as exotic in Texas, which can be a very alienating experience. As a part of her scholarship, she had to go into schools and showcase some music from Puerto Rico, and she found that with a lot of students from Mexico knowing Spanish, she kind of incorporated some funny, little jokes about the gringos of the area as a way to, I think, keep her sanity after being sort of flaunted as this exotic, mysterious person who is really not too much different at her core from everyone else, aside from her culture. At the end of her life, she wrote a story about turning over a smooth pebble on the shore on the beach in Puerto Rico. And as she turned over the stone, she examined her life and the choices that she made and reflected on what it would have been like had she not left the island. And while I can sense from her writing her sense of conflict about that choice, I appreciate her choice to come here because at the end of the day, she did help a lot of people through her social work, other immigrants through her social work, and that legacy was carried on through my mother, who also immigrated as her child from Puerto Rico at the age of 5. And without her, I wouldn't have an extension of home waiting for me in Puerto Rico, a place that is on my mind a lot lately with the damage from the hurricanes.
Hi, my name's Ira Tattleman. My panel is about my grandmother. Her name is Violet Wynne Wallach, and she was born in 1890. She had 4 sisters who had come to America before she did, and when she was 13 years old, her father had died and her mother had remarried, and the mother's new husband determined that he did not want a 13-year-old around the house. She was in Russia, what is now Lithuania, and they sent her to the United States with another 13-year-old girl. The 2 of them traveled across Lithuania, eventually got to the ocean, and took a boat to America. They landed in Massachusetts, in Boston, and even though my grandmother was sick, they allowed her into the United States. And she came and lived briefly with one of her sisters. The problem was that apparently the sister's husband had the hots for her. So she got sent away again, this time up to Bangor, Maine, where she got a high school education. She had spoken Yiddish and learned English and began her life in Bangor, eventually moving back to Massachusetts. No money for college, even though she wanted to go to college, and instead married and had 3 children, one of whom was my mother.
My panel is about Ellis Island and my Polish grandparents that came to the United States in 1914. Through Ellis Island, the first thing they're seeing is the Statue of Liberty, which is on my panel. And they were coming there for a better life. The panel is red, it's white on the top, red on the bottom, which are the colors of the Polish flag. The coat of arms in the white part of the panel has a red eagle. Mine has a red Statue of Liberty. Underneath that, in the other color, is a quote by John F. Kennedy about immigration from 1958, how the United States should have a kind immigration policy because that is how the United States will always be remembered. I find that quote to be extremely applicable right now, and it applied to my family.
My panel is about migration. I am a product of migration. My ancestors include West Africans, East Africans, South Africans, West Europeans, and Ashkenazi. Migration is a big part of the world's history. Through movement of people, ideas were shared, cultures were better understood, and innovations were created. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, where my mixture of my race was looked upon in a negative way. But today I find that my diverse heritage can be understood, and living in America, I'm privileged to be in a society where people are open-minded, are willing to debate peacefully, better ways to move forward, and I look forward to finding solutions, good solutions to our immigration situation.
My panel starts with my parents and my parents-in-law leaving their countries, leaving Sri Lanka, leaving India and the Philippines, and moving to Canada. If they hadn't moved to Canada, I wouldn't have met my husband, and his work is what brought us here. And when I was thinking about their journeys over, I was Googling maps in 1971, world maps, and I discovered this interesting project. For this...
You can start over with I discovered this interesting project.
Okay, thank you. So I discovered this interesting project where an artist was working on maps from 1967 onwards, and the maps reflected geopolitical changes, regime changes, and so I took the map from 1971, the year that started it all.
My panel is about myself and my husband. Both of us are new immigrants to this country. We decided to come here in 1996, soon after we got married. I'm from Ireland and he's from Guyana in South America, but his background is Asian Indian, so basically we're a biracial couple. We decided to come to America because we felt that we had the best opportunities here, that we would both be treated equally fairly, and that we could settle down and have a very nice life here. We're really happy to be here, and my grandfather lived here for 20 years when he was younger, and he always said that this is one of the greatest countries in the world, and he had to go back to Ireland because everybody in his family died. So it was, my mother was super excited when we decided to come here and get his wish for his children to come here.
My one house tile is about my dad. He's a first generation American on my grandmother's side. He was born in Japan in 1949, right after World War II, and his dad is an American soldier and my grandmother is a Tokyo native, and yeah, they just moved back here and started up life again.
So I did my panel on Adele Broom. She was born in 1912 in Richland County, South Carolina. Very beautiful woman. She had 7 children, and shortly after the birth of her last child, her husband passed away, and she became an unwavering protector of her 7 children. She was in South Carolina during a very challenging time. But all of the stories from my mother and her sisters and brothers, really they talked a lot about her strength, how she was a very hard worker, and how she kept a very clean house, and I do remember that growing up. I also remember her praying. That was part of her daily routine. So I witnessed that as a child growing up in her house. But she was very feisty too. She had that prayer thing going on, but she was very feisty in her own right. She left a lot of memories for all of her grandchildren. It seems as though each of us had a very special, different, and unique relationship with her. So in terms of the memories, like I said, everybody had a little something different that they took away from her. But we also had very consistent things that we all remember about her as well. So my grandmother, Adele Broom, has left a legacy of family, a legacy of faith, a legacy of prayer, and a little stylish thing that she always had going on as well. You could always see her rocking a hat, and in fact, the piece that I have on her, she has on her Sunday hat. She's a very strong, graceful woman, but she also had a little fun and feisty side to her. And I try to pass that on to my daughter just to appreciate who she was.
My panel is dedicated to my great-grandmother, Leah Fine, who I'm named after. My middle name is Lee. My grandparents were all from the United States, and so Leah was the first immigrant that I learned about. I have had a picture of her for a long time, and I'm fortunate enough that my 90-year-old mother and my 93-year-old aunt were able to tell me about her. She immigrated from England at a very young age and married in Brooklyn and opened up sort of ship's merchant stores where what is now the Brooklyn Wharves. She sold materials to longshoremen, goods and materials. She married and divorced quite young as well, and she gave birth to my grandmother and her brother. After she divorced, she was able to put her son through dental school, so she really had a successful business. She died quite young from a ruptured appendix, and that's quite sad. My aunt has very fond memories of her as a very strong woman and a very well-liked woman.
My panel is about my great-grandparents who immigrated to Ohio in 1843. The panel shows a picture of them in Ohio at their 60th wedding anniversary. And it also shows a picture of the town where they came from in Germany. It's called Illerick, and a picture of their house and barn in Lorain County, Ohio. And they had 3 children when they came over, and then they had 6 more children. The board also shows the names of all of the other surnames of these ancestors of mine. And I've done a lot of family history, so fortunately it was all set for this project.
Hi, my name is Rosalie O'Donnell, and my panel is about my grandmother, who I was named after, Rosalie Leipold Sadi. She came from Germany when she was 7 years old, and I didn't know much about her. I knew she was from Germany. She settled in Minnesota, and I found out that she had 10 children. I didn't know that. I thought there were 8. In 1898, she had a child out of wedlock, if you can imagine that. I never understood whoever it was. We went and visited his family, but he was never referred to as my uncle, so I learned something new. I also learned that she had a child who was stillborn. So after that, there were 8 more children. She died before I was born, so I never knew her, but I have her name. So the panel is layered with rose petals, because that's our name, Rosalie. And features a photograph of her, which is actually, for those printmakers out there, a photo transfer etchings using PNP, and then text that I drew onto the panel, telling a little bit about her. So I was thrilled to be able to have this opportunity to tell her story a little bit. What was amazing to me is that I can find a lot of information about my grandfathers, but very little information about the women in the family. And that was frustrating to me, but I think that women were probably ignored for a long time and their stories weren't considered important. So I'm glad I have a chance to do this. Thanks.
My panel is about my great-great-grandfather, William H. Trevorrow. He came from St. Ives, Cornwall to Ishpeming, Michigan in 1893. Before coming to Ishpeming, he was a tin miner in Cornwall, and when he came to Michigan, he became an iron ore miner. So the helmet is like what he wore, with a carbide lantern in front, and then beneath the helmet is a cross-section of the earth beneath with a little bit of minerals showing through. He and his son and his son and his son, who is my father, stayed in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and we still have some land up there.
My name is Corinna Woodard, and I came to this country when I was 2 years old with my mother, and that was her first time in this country as well. Her name is Karine Bingo Wilson, and I don't have a photograph of her. I remember seeing the photo, and she described how we came over on a ship, how I slept in a drawer, and she brought her dog with her to this country. And she got emotional. It was very challenging for her to talk about it, but I wanted to make this square to honor our family's trip from Germany, from Berlin, to come to this country. We're glad to be here.
Hi. My panel features Maria Hrgina Shevchikova, who was the matriarch of my family and my mother. She was born in the Czech Republic in 1922, orphaned at a young age, and came to America in the 1940s. She has all sorts of interesting historical little sort of, I guess, interludes in her life. In Prague, she was corralled into a crowd and got to see Hitler march down the street. When she was in the United States, she had the honor of working for people and was able to bake cookies for Harry S. Truman. But again, she was the matriarch of our family, and as I'm working on this, I'm trying to feature some of these stories into this picture I'm drawing of her. And I'm having a hard time with the sketch, and I keep doing it over. And she gets impatient with me, my mother, as I'm sitting there talking to her, and she says, well, I want you to remember me as I'm young. So the picture I have to white out and start over and do several times. And what I could see actually was her dying, because at the end of the summer she died on August 24th of this year. So the picture really is sort of capturing her kind of in mid-flight here and there, which is kind of what our life is. Mid-flight here, mid-flight there, from Europe to America to now. Thank you.